is episode 85 of the Real World Wellness Podcast. Hi everyone, I'm Christine Lehman, a nutritional therapy practitioner and the reverse diabetes coach, which is also the name of my website. I see clients in person and remotely, and I'm accepting a limited number of new clients in May. Please remember while you're listening to the show, advice and information we provide is intended to be helpful and informative, but is not a substitute for medical advice or treatment. So today I want to talk about childhood obesity, and I'm going to focus primarily on the teenage years, starting at age 13, and provide you a case example because I recently counseled a 17-year-old about his diet as well as lifestyle and had good success. He lost 30 pounds in the first 7 weeks. So we're still working together, but I wanted to share some of those successful strategies with you. I also wanted to say for the parents listening to the podcast that ideally you're living a healthy lifestyle because you have the greatest influence on your children's life, including their nutrition, because typically the parents are doing the shopping and meal preparation. You also can influence a child's physical activity, especially outside the home. So at minimum, you want to encourage healthy choices. So why is obesity such a huge issue in children? Well, unfortunately, the rates of obesity have really increased since the 1970s. Today, about 1 in 5 school-age children, and I'm referring to ages 6 to 19, are obese according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So just to define obesity, it is when you have excess body fat, and of course adults are obese as well. But a good measurement to figure out where you fall in this scale is to use what's called the body mass index, or BMI. That is a screening tool used for both overweight and obesity. So of course there's normal, then overweight, and then obesity in this continuum. And basically what you want is the numbers that you need are height and weight. And you take the height and divide it by the weight. And that gives you the number to know where you fall. So generally, children with a BMI of at or above the 85th percentile and less than the 95th percentile are considered overweight. Children at or above the 95th percentile are considered obese. So how does this impact children? Well, there's a lot of effects on their physical, social, and emotional health. For example, children with obesity are at greater risk for having other chronic health conditions and diseases such as asthma, sleep apnea, bone and joint problems, type 2 diabetes, and risk factors for heart disease. Obesity is a big risk factor for metabolic syndrome, which you may have heard of, which also leads to insulin resistance and markers for heart disease. It also puts you at greater risk of a condition called visceral or abdominal fat, and that is also associated with metabolic syndrome. Unfortunately, children with obesity tend to be bullied and teased more than children with normal weight, and that are more likely to suffer from social isolation, depression, and low self-esteem. And then in the long term, if you're obese as a child, you're more likely to become obese as an adult, which is also linked to those conditions that I just mentioned, and also cancer. So it's really a risk factor for many conditions, and the best thing you can do is to get a handle on it now so that it doesn't progress into adulthood. And this is the argument that I also used with the 17-year-old that I helped recently, and I'm still continuing to help, is he's a junior in high school, and I was happy that we are at least addressing it now versus in his senior year. Not that it's too late, but that gives me more time to work with him. since he weighs over 300 pounds, realistically it's going to take up to a year to drop the at least 100 pounds that he needs to lose. But he is motivated, and once people see the weight come off, as I said, he lost 30 pounds in 7 weeks, then it gives you momentum to keep going with it. And that's true of both adults and children. So I also think that other factors that are contributing to childhood obesity could be genetics. This is sort of the nurture versus nature argument, but can be a genetic component. But the good news is most of it, I think, is environmental, more the nature side, and you can do a lot to change the outcomes. But I do think kids these days have more factors working against them than I did, and now I'm middle-aged, and when I was growing up, there weren't computers. We were much more physically active. It makes me sad that many schools have cut out physical education. I think that's a mistake. Children naturally have fairly high energy levels and need to expend some of that energy and calories. Also, there is just so many more junk food options and poor nutritional options available than what my mother, who did spend time in the kitchen preparing meals, had available. So I think there's just sort of a confluence of factors that are contributing to both the sedentary lifestyle and poor nutrition. So, and the schools, unfortunately, also have not necessarily the most nutrient-dense options, especially with the vending machines and making sodas available. And I would urge you to get involved with your school to advocate for healthy nutrition options there as well. So with that as the background, I'm going to give you some strategies to help children, and specifically or especially teenagers in your life, have a healthier lifestyle. So let's start with nutrition. And I also just want to quickly add that inflammation is also an issue in obesity, regardless of what age you are. So you want to emphasize as many low inflammation options as possible, including both exercise and diet. So since I specialize in nutrition, let's start there. The key thing with what we call the standard American diet is it's highly processed. So just doing something, and I don't mean to say it's simple, it's not, but moving away from processed food and towards a traditional whole foods diet is critical. If you can do that, you've made like 90% progress right there. And the traditional whole foods diets are typically called ancestral health diets. There's also the Weston A. Price Foundation, paleo and primal are some examples of that. But the emphasis really on all of these diets is on natural whole foods. And the idea is nutrient dense, so that you get more nutrients from a whole foods diet than you are from a typical commercially processed diet. And the other problem with the processed food is that the food, and this is coming from the food industry, right? They're the ones producing the bulk of, commercial food. So this is, they typically add sugar, they add low quality fats, and sodium, just to name a few of the unhealthy ingredients that have led and contributed to the obesity epidemic. So the other thing to consider is inflammation. As I said, you want to not engage the autoimmune system and trigger the inflammatory process. So if you suspect your children have any food allergies do engage the autoimmune system. So, and trigger that inflammatory process. So you want to avoid those foods. You want to have your children tested for food allergies. It's an easy blood test if you suspect that they're having these kind of allergic reactions. But if if they're not allergic, for example, to milk proteins, whey, and casein in dairy, you may want to include some grass-fed dairy in their diet in the form of fermented or cultured milk, which is better for the gut because it has probiotics, and it can give you a source of concentrated calcium, which we'll get into a little bit more later. So now I'm getting on to the macronutrient categories, which are protein, carbs, and fats. So just to finish the thought about milk, you also want to avoid low-fat milk. We do need a certain amount of healthy fat in our diet. I know there's that low-fat versus full-fat or whole-fat controversy, but I think most people know by now that you need a fair amount of healthy fat. That's the distinction I make. Unhealthy fats are trans fats, and also if you were to eat perhaps a ton of saturated fats. But the main, I'm not typically in the low saturated fat camp, but that's another discussion. So the point is you need both saturated and unsaturated fats. And you don't want to necessarily go the low-fat route, even though it may sound counterintuitive, because whole fat, especially also in dairy, allows you to have greater amounts of vitamin D, which is a fat-soluble vitamin, and K2. And you need those vitamins to help absorb calcium. So you also don't want pasteurized milk because it removes important bacteria for gut health. And you can listen to episode 83 to learn more about bone health, but vitamin K2 makes sure that the calcium reaches your bones, and vitamin D is very important for calcium absorption. So I recommend good whole fat sources of calcium in dairy with probiotics such as kefir or yogurt that is grass-fed. And also, if you're lactose intolerant, you usually can tolerate low amounts of fermented or cultured dairy over regular dairy. So also sources of omega-3, they're typically an imbalance in the standard American diet between omega-6 and omega-3. And omega-3 sources are fatty fish, cod, and sardines. Fatty fish includes salmon, which also has good vitamin D in there, as well as mackerel and tuna are examples of fatty fish. Sardines are also good sources of omega-3. So again, you want to try and correct the imbalance between omega-3 and omega-6. Other sources of unsaturated healthy fats, especially mono, include extra virgin olive oil. I recommend cold press, as well as nut oils like walnut oil and so on. So going back to other forms of nutrients in the diet, you also want to make sure you're getting enough fiber. And most people are not eating enough fruits and vegetables, which I'm sure you've heard, but they are a good source of fiber, as well as some calcium, some vitamin C, and some minerals. So I do recommend you make sure you incorporate fruits and vegetables into your diet. Now, you don't have to go for the most sugary. The sweeter the fruit, for example, you might suspect the more sugar it has. So papaya or pineapple, you don't necessarily have to go that route. You can get plenty of good vitamins and minerals in less glycemic fruit, such as peaches, apples. Berries are one of my favorites because they have good antioxidants. And you also want to keep the skin on because that helps give you some minerals as well as fiber. Same thing for vegetables. Most Americans aren't eating vegetables in the whole food form. The tubers also give you fiber, which also is important to have enough for frankly, healthy bowel movements, and good sources of fiber, again, are sweet potatoes and other tubers. That means they grow in the ground, by the way, and parsnips, even a type called taro, but that can be hard to find. Squash is another good one. And other sources of vegetables that I recommend that are not necessarily tubers, but they're the leafy greens. So most people are not eating enough spinach, they're not eating enough kale. If you can buy from a farmer, I buy my food from a local farmer at the farmer's market. And it is important to get it organic, right? Who needs pesticides sprayed all over their food? So, or insecticides for that matter. So I do definitely recommend organic. So organic should just be, frankly, a rule of thumb for all your food, regardless of whether it's fruit or vegetables. But again, you want to get enough leafy greens into your diet. You can saute them. You don't even have to make a salad all the time. Sometimes I just throw kale on a skillet with some extra virgin olive oil. Same thing with spinach. Cooked spinach actually increases the amount of nutrients in it, so it doesn't always have to be raw or a salad, but I do recommend getting at least a few salads in during your week. So those are some of the deficient areas that I think a lot of the American diet is deficient in. In addition to healthy fats and carbs, and carbs, by the way, also include things like nuts and seeds. And I would avoid gluten as much as possible because it can trigger inflammation. You can always get tested for a gluten sensitivity, but some people it's rare, but there is also celiac disease, which is an autoimmune disorder. Also, some grains can trigger an inflammatory response. So if your child is having some gut issues like leaky gut syndrome, which I've talked about on previous podcasts, I would recommend eliminating all grains for a time until their gut is healed. But at minimum, going gluten-free, because as I said, gluten is pro-inflammatory. So moving on, exercise. This is another pillar of my program. By the way, the 4 pillars are diet, exercise, stress management, and supplements. But with children, unless there are real problems with getting adequate food sources, I generally shy away from supplements and use those more with adults as needed. So walking is a good low-impact activity. So for children who are obese, just like adults, they're putting more pressure on their joints. So I like to start out with low-impact activities. My client, the 17-year-old boy I've been working with, would like to walk. And the other advantage of walking is that they may already be doing it anyway. For example, in schools, they typically have to walk a certain distance from one class to another. Another trick, if you will, is using the stairs. Just like adults use the stairs, I recommend using the stairs, taking advantage of things that are frankly already kind of available to you and part of your routine. So instead of taking the elevator, take the stairs. Walk to places as much as possible. Also, other low impact exercise can be things like yoga. Yoga is very good for children. It helps them with their flexibility. It's very good for toning. I just wrote an article about yoga, and it's also, again, very gentle. And that's an important point, because you don't want to trigger the stress hormones, which include adrenaline and noradrenaline, as well as cortisol, which are all part of can trigger inflammation, or that pathway that can trigger inflammation. So you want to kind of keep it gentle and easy on the joints to start out with. The other key is finding activities that your children enjoy. It really doesn't work if they don't enjoy the activity because it won't stick. So now I want to talk about sleep. Sleep is really critical, and there are some really good recommendations for sleep. The older the child is, the less sleep they need per day, the less number of hours. So for example, a child 7 to 12 years old would need 10 to 11 hours daily, whereas a child between 12 and 18 years old will need 8 to 9 hours per day. But it's just as vital to their health and well-being for teenagers as when they were younger. In fact, many teenagers actually need more sleep, and I think that's due in part to the schedules they keep. And as you might imagine, if you have any contact with a teenager, they tend to sleep less during the week and then try to make up for it on the weekends, which is not the best or the healthiest habit to get into. And with the teenager I'm working with, he would be up late playing computer games on his, obviously on his computer, but he would, we talked about how to shift his bedtime schedule so that he would get to bed earlier and therefore get up earlier, because he was also running out the door without breakfast in the morning, which is another thing that we've changed. So we agreed that in order for him to get 8 hours sleep, he'd have to be in bed by 10:30 and up at 6:30, which is a fairly reasonable schedule. And I don't mean that as a rigid thing, but that is a guideline. You want them to have at least 8 hours of sleep. And obviously it's very important for their functioning, mental, physical, emotional functioning, and well-being. The other thing that, speaking of computers, it's very important to have children wind down in a digital detox before they go to bed. So we talked about turning the computer off an hour before bedtime. So he needed to wind down around starting at 9:30 at the latest, and importance of establishing some kind of routine. And I explained to him, staring at a computer screen is more likely to keep you awake. So that's really important, because I suspect some children have TVs and computers maybe and other forms of digital appliances in their room, and you really want to kind of screen for those and make sure and try to reduce the amount of digital appliances and computers in the child's room, and make sure they're turned off at night as well. So those are the most important things I wanted to touch on today. And I just wanted to go back to calcium and say that the recommended amount for children age 9 to 13 years is 1,300 milligrams daily, and that is the same for children 14 to 18 years. So it's important that they get enough calcium from both dairy as well as leafy greens, and fruit are also another source of it, but not as much as dairy and the leafy greens. So next episode, I will be interviewing Dr. Debbie Hamilton, who's an integrative physician and pediatrician, and she has a new book out that focuses on ADHD and autism in children. So stay tuned for that episode, and have a great, healthy week.